A warning. This podcast contains descriptions of sexual and family violence and self-harm, which some listeners may find disturbing. You can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the Domestic Violence Hotline 1-800-RESPECT.
Subscribers to Shadow of Doubt get to hear episodes first and get access to all our bonus material. Subscribe at theaustralian.com.au or check out our channel on Apple Podcasts, Crime X Plus.
On a spring afternoon, 8 months after she had been arrested for the sexual abuse of 2 of her daughters, Susan Johnson was driving home on a country road after picking up her son Daniel from school when she spotted a figure in the distance. Slowing down, she was startled to see that it was her estranged daughter Emily, dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, stumbling in the direction of the home that they'd once shared. Susan Johnson was forbidden from approaching her daughter because of an apprehended violence order. But as she drew closer, her son insisted they pull over, threatening to jump out of the car if his mother didn't stop. Earlier that morning, Detective Reese Thompson, who was investigating the Johnson family, had telephoned the local sexual assault centre and reported that Emily would be coming in because she'd had some new memories surfacing, and they were about her mother. Emily had arrived at the centre at 3 o'clock, and during the counselling session, she had recounted a memory of her mother that was more ghastly than any she'd recalled over the past 18 months. She said that when she was 12, her parents had forced her to participate in an orgy with them in their bedroom, during which the abuse had made her physically ill, and her father had forced her to eat her own vomit. Emily was so disturbed at the end of the counselling session that she had left the centre disorientated and dazed after handing her car keys, phone and wallet to her social worker Donna. She'd last been seen wandering through town on foot, and a police alert had been issued. Emily's mother knew nothing of this. She knew only that the daughter she hadn't seen for more than 2 years was suddenly in front of her and in danger of being hit by a car. What happened next is fiercely disputed, but both Susan Johnson and her son Daniel give the same account.
So I then pulled over. There was only actually one spot you can pull over, which was, I'd estimate about 100 metres or if not further. And he then ran out to and she hugged him tightly, and she came towards the car, and I just thought I'm not allowed to go near her, but she came and hugged me, and I said to her, I can't go near you, and she said to me, You never tried, Mum. You never tried. That's all. I remember those words distinctly because they still cut me today. They just cut me so deeply. And she was very disorientated and very distressed.
Susan Johnson called her daughter Rebecca, who drove to the scene to find her sister huddled next to her brother as their mother stood across the other side of the road. She told me that Emily seemed dazed and bewildered, confused about where she was.
So I said to her, "What's happened? Why are you out here?" She said, "I don't know how I got here. I don't know." Like, she was angry. She was frustrated. She was like all over the shop. I just basically, I didn't question her too much. Obviously being in that situation, Mum there over the other side of the road, and it was like she was hallucinating, like she actually didn't know.
I'm Richard Guilliatt, and this is Shadow of Doubt. Episode 6. They call it Dissociation. As Rebecca Johnson was driving to the location where her mother had found her sister, she had called police and alerted them to what was happening. But Emily, she recalls, was not happy to hear that police might be on their way and angrily berated her for calling them.
I said, I've called the police. And she yelled at me. She goes, "What did you do that for?" And I said, "Because I have to." I said, "Mum's not allowed near you." She was not happy about that. I said, "Look, I'm not don't talk about anything about the case." And I said, "That's for the courts to worry about." I said, "I just want to make sure you're okay."
As it turned out, no police ever turned up, and the light began to fade as they stood talking. Emily was angry that her counsellors were planning to place her in a share house, recalls Rebecca, and she seemed confused about why she had no phone or wallet. She began crying as she looked across at their mother, and their conversation took some unexpected turns.
I said, "Oh, how are you?" She goes, "Oh, I'm not good." "Well, how do you think I am? I'm on Centrelink and they want to put me in a shared house." And I said, "Yeah, I said, everyone's struggling. You know, this is hard on everyone." I said, "Look," I said, I love you and I'm here for you 110%, but I said, I can't support you in any of the allegations." She said to me, "I didn't even write all that, the DPP did." Now, I'll never forget those words. "I didn't even write all that, the DPP did." And I'm like, I'll never forget. I'm like, what the fuck? What does that mean?
It happened that 3 people who knew the Johnson family would drive past while these events were unfolding: a school bus driver, a cafe owner, and a member of Susan Johnson's training squad. They all later signed statements confirming that they saw Emily's mother sitting in her car at some distance from her children. 2 of them stopped and spoke to Susan Johnson, who assured them that everything was okay. The cafe owner recalled that Emily appeared unhappy, and he thought there was a domestic dispute happening. Eventually, Emily used her brother's mobile phone to call her boyfriend, Sam, and Rebecca offered to drive her back to town to meet him at a McDonald's restaurant. On the drive there, they kept talking.
I spoke to her and I said, "Oh, how are you anyway? How's everything going?" And I said, "How did you get out here?" And she said, "Oh, I don't remember." And I said, "Oh, you look good." And she looked terrible, but I was being really nice and trying to talk and see what she was up to. And she goes, she goes like this, she goes, "My stuff." I said, "Oh, where's your stuff?" She goes, "I don't know." And she goes, "Oh, yeah." She goes, I don't remember." And then I said, "Oh, this is home driving." I'm like, right, okay. I'm like, this is weird. And then she's like, "They call it dissociation." And I said, "Dissociation, I don't remember things. I can't remember."
As they arrived at the McDonald's, a police car pulled into the car park, and Emily walked towards it. The female constable she spoke to later testified that Emily appeared anxious and was glancing over at Rebecca, who called out, "You have to stop this. It's been going on for 2 years. Look at what this is doing." Emily asked the constable to call Detective Thompson, explaining that she wanted to drop the charges against her parents. But the detective couldn't be reached, and at that moment, Emily's boyfriend arrived in his car, so she left with him after hugging her sister. The following day, Susan Johnson turned up at the local police station with Rebecca to report in as part of her bail conditions. But she never got home that day because when Detective Thompson appeared in the foyer, the police station was suddenly locked down.
We went in and they locked down the police station. They just locked it down and said we're both under arrest. And it was just, like, again, just the absolute shock of my life.
The charge was attempting to influence a witness, and mother and daughter were put in adjoining cells. Susan Johnson told Detective Thompson that her teenage son was outside in the car waiting, and she says the detective replied, "That's not my problem." Daniel had a learning disability, and he spent 2 hours in the car, frightened, until he decided to catch a bus to a friend's house. Rebecca was eventually released that afternoon, but their mother had also been charged with breaching both her bail and her AVO conditions, and she was refused bail. She spent 2 nights in the lockup before being transferred to a nearby prison. Emily hadn't dropped the charges against her parents after all. Instead, she'd gone to police the day after her mother found her wandering on the road and signed a statement accusing both her mother and her sister of pressuring her to abandon the case. Emily said her mother had angrily berated her, waved a stick, and told her she would never see her siblings again if she persisted with the allegations. She said Rebecca had told her if she didn't drop the case, she would end up dead. Detective Thompson secured statements from several residents who lived near the incident and said they'd overheard or witnessed Emily and Rebecca arguing. Susan Johnson would spend 3 nights in prison before a magistrate granted her bail and released her. She says she began to realise the police were trying to break her.
That was the initial, first time I was put in a prison, and I didn't understand why, and yeah, it was horrific. I didn't even eat. I didn't eat for 2 days. That I'd done all the right things, yet this still happened. I felt there was something else happening to make sure, that just pushing me to an absolute point of breaking, and well, they nearly did, but it wasn't going to happen.
Susan Johnson now faced 2 sets of charges and a separate legal bill for Rebecca, whose sports career was now in jeopardy because police had seized her passport. Emily's new memory of a grotesque orgy with her parents was added to the allegations against them, and police drew up 117 charges against Martin Johnson, naming Emily and Sarah as his victims. Police were also contacting the former students who had accused him 3 decades earlier, with a view to laying more charges. The police investigation of the Johnsons was potentially blossoming into a multitude of separate trials, and the couple sold a property to fund their defence. Shortly before she was due in court on the interfering with a witness charge, Susan Johnson got a call from her lawyer reporting that prosecutors were offering a deal. They would drop the charges against her if she testified against her husband.
And I actually went to see him and said, this is what I can say, that he was at times controlling or disciplinarian. This is the way he coached. He was probably out of control at times. And he goes, no, that's not what I want to hear. They want to hear that you saw these things. And that's when I said, so you're asking me to lie? And he said, if you want to put it that way.
Susan Johnson refused that offer, and a year after her fateful roadside encounter with Emily, she flew to Sydney with Rebecca to face the charges of interfering with a witness. But once again, there was a hitch. Emily's psychiatrist had written a report suggesting that the proceedings should be postponed. Emily, she said, might suffer an adverse emotional experience while testifying against her mother and sister, which could jeopardise her ability to give evidence in her parents' trial. Such a delay would have been disastrous for Rebecca, because it could be years before she got her passport back to compete overseas. In a plea deal struck by her lawyers, she reluctantly agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of interfering with a witness and was given a good behaviour bond. Even today, the memory of that causes her to break down.
I had no idea till I was brought into the room by the lawyers. What do you mean? I only have a choice to plead guilty. I was beside myself. And anyway, they went back, they bargained for a couple of hours, and then they basically said, look, we've got it down to no criminal record. And basically, you can plead guilty on the basis that you're there to save a life that day. So I had to go before the court, and basically I made the decision to take it because it meant that I had to wait till gosh knows when, and my life and my work, everything depended on it. And I can't even explain how uncomfortable I felt. I actually went on the stand and had to say the words guilty, and I literally thought I was going to faint and die, like my heart that day. And I literally, to this day, I'm not comfortable that I got that bond. And That's fine. Sorry. I had 2 years, it gave me no option. So I had a living on bail.
10 days later, her father was finally extradited from overseas, and in a brief court hearing, he was refused bail and sent to prison. Martin Johnson had hired his own lawyer, Andrew Bale, an experienced criminal solicitor based in Brisbane, who came recommended by a friend. When Bale flew to New South Wales for an early hearing, he was struck immediately by the unusual atmosphere around the case.
Because just by virtue of having been around and been part of the furniture, you'd like to think you have a pretty sensible relationship with investigating police. And I showed up to the local court and the police officers were wheeling trolleys and trolleys of documents into court, but wouldn't let me see what any of them were. And I was the defence. I was saying to them, listen, you've got to give that to me. I'm the defence. And I was just met with stonewalling. My client had lots of information because, of course, it was in relation to his daughter. And every avenue of investigation that he gave us to try and find out anything about the case was just met with a complete brick wall. The police wouldn't even speak to me. If I rang them, they would hang up on me.
Bale couldn't reconcile the depraved violence that was described in the police brief with the loving messages that Emily and Sarah Johnson had sent their parents over the years, or the happy family snapshots scattered through their scrapbooks and photo albums. A committal hearing was scheduled before a magistrate to determine whether the case should go to trial, and Bale wanted to question Emily Johnson to find out more about her mental health treatment. But the magistrate denied the request, and the Johnsons were committed for trial. The magistrate began visiting Emily Johnson in hospital, and on one occasion allowed her to stay in his house overnight when he and his wife were not there. A local lawyer I spoke to recalled entering the magistrate's courtroom one day to see Emily Johnson sitting next to him at the bench, apparently as part of a study program. When I contacted the magistrate and asked whether it was appropriate for him to have personal contact with a complainant in a case that hadn't yet reached trial, he said that was for others to decide. The Johnsons' former lawyer, Andrew Bale, certainly has an opinion.
I'm staggered that a judicial officer would form some sort of relationship with a complainant in a very serious case like this before the matter has been determined by a court. It has to fundamentally erode the public confidence in the judiciary where there's such a staggering lack of insight into the role. It represents, in my view, a gross lack of judgment. I'm not suggesting that there's necessarily something inappropriate that's happened here, but fundamentally, when justice is to be done, justice needs to be seen to be done. And if there is an inappropriate relationship, or if there is any relationship at all between a judicial officer and a complainant, that's got to erode the public confidence in the system.
But the magistrate wasn't the only person affected by the dreadful nature of the allegations. Susan Johnson's sister Philippa cut off contact with her and became Emily and Sarah's principal support person in the family. She couldn't understand why her sister was seemingly abandoning her daughters to support her husband. Police warned both sides of the family to have no contact with each other. So when the Johnsons' son Daniel caught a bus to visit his maternal grandmother one day, she refused to let him in and called the police. When I asked her about this episode, she told me that Detective Thompson had told her it was not safe to have any contact with her daughter or the two children who were supporting her. Susan Johnson says she realised that even her own lawyers seemed to believe the allegations. During a district court hearing in Sydney to apply for a separate trial, her barrister mistakenly told the judge that she had known about her husband's sexual offending against their daughters. Although she leapt up to correct the error, the judge denied her a separate trial, describing the case as atrocious and saying there could be no doubt that Susan Johnson had known about her daughter's suffering for at least a decade.
Yes, I was absolutely horrified. See, this is what I mean. People just assumed from the very beginning, people assumed. No one listened to me. I paid all this money for this barrister, this QC, who was not even briefed correctly or who I'd never spoken to again, about this. There was always this presumption that I was guilty with all my lawyers. And it was very, very frustrating because they just did not listen to me.
By then, police had drawn up criminal charges against Martin Johnson over the allegations he had faced as a teacher in the 1980s. 3 of the former students who had complained about him had provided police with new statements, and 2 of those women were now making much more serious allegations than they had as teenagers. We can't detail those allegations for legal reasons, but they stated that Johnson had engaged in penetrative sex with them when they were in their mid-teens. Faced with mounting legal bills, the Johnsons were forced to sell their home. For Susan Johnson, it was especially devastating because the ashes of 2 children she had lost were buried on the property. Andrew Bale now began representing both parents, and he subpoenaed the records of Emily's school and family doctors. But her teachers, her GP and her paediatrician had noticed nothing unusual, and nor had any of the 20-odd friends of the family who provided statements. Bale drew up a timeline showing that Emily claimed to have been viciously tortured only days before she had won major sporting events. She alleged that shortly before she first went into hospital, her father had struck her in the face one day, dragged her to the creek by her hair, choked her, and violated her with a rusty tool. But at the time, she was already in counselling at the sexual assault centre with Donna, who had noticed no physical signs of assault. You might recall from episode 4 that when Emily had first spoken to police and accused her father of raping her in a swimming pool car park, a gynecological examination had found nothing unusual. But 1.5 years later, police had sent Emily to Sydney with her counsellor, Donna, for an examination by a different doctor. The report from that examination, by Dr. Christine Norrie, stated that injuries to Emily's hymen indicated she had suffered blunt force trauma before puberty. Andrew Bale wanted a second opinion, and he called Dr. Maria Nidis, a senior forensic doctor in Western Sydney. He was stunned to learn that Dr. Nidis had been present during the examination of Emily, and she disputed Dr. Norrie's findings.
I'd rung the doctor and I was having a conversation with her, and we identified that she was the supervising doctor to the doctor that actually conducted this examination, and in fact was present at the examination but was not present when the report was written. And she was astounded as to the conclusions that had been recorded in the report, and said that they were just not capable of being, the conclusions were not capable of being drawn.
Today, Dr. Nidis works with the Queensland Forensic Health Service, and she remains concerned about the Johnson case.
We have a young woman who is now, a young adult of a very long history of sexual assault, and yet she was able to recount some of these episodes when they're not related to, special events like maybe Christmas or something, in incredible detail. Now, while I acknowledge and I accept that some people have photographic memories, that's not common. And while I acknowledge and accept that some people will keep diaries, if you were going to write a diary about sexual assault, you wouldn't want it found, I would imagine. You wouldn't want it easily decipherable. And even if you were noting what had happened, I'm not sure that you would document the colour of the socks or which hand of your father touched which leg of your... It's just that level of detail was, I thought, very unusual. Now, that's not to say in any way, shape or form that she has not undergone some sort of traumatic event or that she hasn't been sexually assaulted. but I just was concerned enough by the history and the way it was documented that I thought a forensic psychiatric review mightn't be a bad idea.
I asked Dr. Nittis about the injuries that Dr. Norrie had noted, whether they were all that unusual to find in a 20-year-old young woman. Could they, for instance, have been caused by normal sexual activity?
That would have been my assumption. I certainly wouldn't have gone to court to say anything otherwise. And I believe in this particular case, there was an allegation of a prior sexual assault. Now, how you could say that the injuries we now saw were not from that alone, I don't know. I definitely wouldn't have felt comfortable saying that.
And if that was the case, what evidence was there to support Dr. Norrie's belief that one of the injuries had happened before puberty? According to Dr. Nittis, there is no research that backs that up.
Now, I know Dr. Norrie came to that conclusion because of, her extensive experience in the number of cases she's seen. And, I certainly defer to her experience in this area. However, I don't think there is available research that actually supports that at this stage. And I think, there's, while it's very difficult to do proper research in either adolescents or children or adults of the genital area for quite obvious reasons, I think without that evidence that's been done, sometimes we can be a little bit biased in our findings just based on our own observations. Sometimes we accept as factual things that we're told, which may or may not in fact be factual. So that's the reason why we look for, good, strong evidence. But, of course, in this area, it is a little lacking.
To Andrew Bale, Dr. Nittis's opinion could not have been more significant. She had helped in the examination of Emily at the request of prosecutors, and she not only contradicted the medical report they were relying on, but she also questioned Emily's reliability. Bale wanted to see Emily's counselling and hospital records, but access to such files in sexual assault cases has been severely restricted since the 1990s on privacy grounds. Defence lawyers must first convince a judge that the counselling notes could contain significant evidence, a difficult task without knowing what's actually in them. The judge who had refused to give Susan Johnson a separate trial had also refused to release Emily's counselling records. But the Johnsons got a breakthrough when the lawyer contacted Tara, the young woman who'd shared a hotel room overseas with Emily on the night she said she had been sexually assaulted by a team official. Tara told Andrew Bale about her conversation with Emily 5 years earlier, when Emily had called her from hospital and disclosed that her memory of that overseas sexual assault came back to her after she returned home. And then Tara told him about another unusual phone call she'd had with Emily more recently. Here is Tara herself recounting that conversation.
So she and I had kept in touch over the years that followed, and I wanted to see how she was doing, so I gave her a call. And she had told me that things were getting more complicated with, all of the things that were going on in her life. But at the same breath, she sounded a bit positive, empowered maybe. And, things have gotten more complicated is what she was telling me. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, I've actually remembered these things that my father had done to me when I was a young child. And I had no memory of any of this before our overseas trip. But since coming back and since remembering, the incident that happened to her overseas, that then allowed her to remember what had happened when she was a young child and what her father had done to her. When I asked her for more details, because again I was confused and I didn't understand, she said that her father sexually abused her for years and that he had used scissors to cut her vagina and that, they were bloodied, and that was the the severity of the trauma, and that he, would keep her in. Sometimes he would bring her out to a shed, and that she had, when she was younger, buried these items, buried the scissors and buried the undies, and she was remembering all the events, and that she had recently uncovered those items. And I didn't know how to take that information and what to do with that, because as you can imagine, that's huge. And I just said to her, how sorry I was that this had happened to her. And she said, don't be silly. If it wasn't for what had happened, I would have never recalled all of the events that happened with my father. I said, so what do you mean these are repressed memories? And she said, yes, and now I remember them. I was obviously very shocked, and I asked her, did her mother know? And where was her mother during all of this? And she had said to me, and I can't exactly recall, but it was either that her mother knew but was so overwhelmed by it that she wasn't able to intervene in any way, or that it also happened to her mother, that her mother was also being abused, so that's why her mother couldn't help in any way. And then I asked, what about, your sisters? Did this happen to them too? And she said it had also happened to them, but it had happened to her in sort of a worse degree.
Andrew Bale understood the importance of what Tara was saying. The details she remembered from the conversation about the scissors, the shed, and the buried tools could only have come from someone with close knowledge of the case, like Emily. It gave weight to Tara's credibility. More importantly, if it were true that Emily hadn't remembered any of her father's abuse until she was 18, if her allegations were based entirely on repressed memories, the reliability of the entire case could be challenged.
Frankly, the things that she disclosed to me were explosive. They fundamentally undermined the Crown case.
But police and prosecutors didn't see it that way. Notified about Tara's statement, Detective Thompson took a new statement from Emily, who denied that she had divulged any details of abuse to Tara or spoken to her about repressed memories. When I interviewed Tara, I asked her whether there was any chance that she'd misremembered her conversation with Emily. She replied that it wasn't the kind of conversation you ever forget. And Tara's information was also important because it gave the Johnsons' lawyer a legitimate reason to subpoena the hospital and the sexual assault centre for their records of Emily's treatment. 2 years after Martin Johnson's arrest, more than 3,000 pages of those files were sent to the New South Wales District Court, where hearings were held over several months to determine whether the Johnsons' lawyers could look at them. A judge eventually granted access to a portion of those records after reviewing them and blacking out extensive passages to protect Emily's privacy. To Andrew Bale, the counselling records offered irrefutable proof that Emily's memories of abuse had been recovered in counselling. They confirmed that she'd at first denied ever being abused by her father, and they were filled with references to her flashbacks and dissociative episodes. He wrote to Crown prosecutors, urging them to reconsider the case.
And we received a one-line response, rejecting anything that we had to say about that.
Bale sent the counselling and hospital notes to the Sydney forensic psychiatrist, Dr. John Roberts. Dr. Roberts noted that Emily had undergone sand-tray therapy to help her retrieve her memories, and that she was reported to have remembered a specific assault at the age of 3, which neurological research suggested would be impossible. Dr. Roberts concluded that her allegations could only be relied on through independent corroboration. But his report would never be presented to a jury because, as it was being written, the Johnsons, suffered a massive setback. They ran out of money. The court hearings had dragged on for 2 years, costing them up to $6,000 a day in legal fees. They had cashed in their super, sold all their assets, and raised more than $900,000, and it was all gone. When Andrew Bale applied to New South Wales Legal Aid for funding, he was refused because of the cost of accommodating a Queensland solicitor in Sydney for a criminal trial that could last months. Susan Johnson remembers her shock when Bale told a court hearing that he would have to withdraw from the case.
I'd sold the house, next to nothing, like our beautiful home, you know, where I had my ashes with my children. You know, it was 20 years we'd lived there, and it was really difficult to sell it really, really cheaply just to give him that final check, hoping that was going to take us to trial. And then when he stood there and said, you know, they don't have any more money left, we need more money, that was his words. Everything was gone. Super, absolutely everything. Over $1 million, I think, at that time, in our own money.
Legal Aid would take 2 months to approve the funding for their new lawyers, and a month out from the trial's scheduled start, their new solicitor told the court he was still waiting to receive the roughly 1,000 pages of medical and counselling notes. Those notes had been available for months, and it's unclear why that delay happened. But at the time, the solicitor was also the lead defence counsel in one of the biggest organised crime cases in the state's history. Susan Johnson remembers visiting his office in Sydney for the first time, a week before the trial was due to start, and finding it in a state of chaos. Scores of documents from their previous legal team were strewn about the office, some of them on the floor.
He said to me, "We're very disorganised. All the stuff's just been sent down. We've got a few days before the trial starts." And he gave me this exercise book and he said, "You need to photocopy all of this. I haven't got enough staff." And I spent 2 days photocopying, and he said, "Go through anything you feel will help." And it was a mess. There were documents everywhere.
This account of a legal team scrambling to prepare for the trial is backed up by documents I found among the court files. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to start, Martin Johnson's barrister emailed the lead prosecutor asking for copies of crucial statements, including the report of Dr. Maria Nittis and Tara's statement about her conversations with Emily Johnson. The barrister appeared to be unaware that those statements had been commissioned by the previous defence team, not the DPP. At the time, Martin Johnson hadn't yet been able to meet his barrister in the prison where he was being held. That same week, the Johnsons announced a dramatic change of tactics. They had previously told the court that they planned to argue that Emily Johnson had experienced repressed memories of abuse, which were false. Now, they told prosecutors they wouldn't be pushing that argument after all. Susan Johnson's barrister, meanwhile, was appointed at the last minute after her previous counsel suddenly withdrew. 8 days out from the beginning of the trial, he told the judge he hadn't read any of the counselling notes and couldn't decipher much of the handwriting. Susan Johnson recalls her alarm when he told her that his strategy was to convince the jury that her husband's behaviour had nothing to do with her.
He just kept saying, "The tools, all those types of allegations have nothing to do with you. We're doing a separate trial. We'll just focus on us." And I kept saying, "No, that's not going to work because this just did not happen." So what about the mental health grounds? And he said, "Oh, you can bring that out in your evidence." And he said, "You seem to have been very, so were you controlled?" And then I just started to get really distressed, saying, "No, that's not how it happened." And I just tried to explain everything.
The trial finally began on an autumn morning in the Sydney District Court, and the first witness was Emily Johnson, who had by then been in counselling for more than 6 years. Over that time, her psychiatrist, Dr. Warner, had completed a master's degree in bioethics and had given Emily a new diagnosis, dissociative identity disorder. It's not clear when this diagnosis was made, because Emily's most recent hospital records hadn't been made available to her parents. But dissociative identity disorder, or DID as it's commonly known, is perhaps the most controversial illness in all of psychiatry, as we'll hear in the next episode. Martin Johnson says he expected that issue to be a central part of the defence in the trial, and he recalls discussing with his barrister the idea of confronting the mental health questions around dissociative identity disorder and repressed memory. But the lawyers had a different strategy in mind. They wouldn't call their expert psychiatrist, Dr. Roberts, or Emily's friend, Tara, or the medical expert, Dr. Maria Nidis. Martin Johnson recalls the barrister telling him that they would convince the jury that Emily was lying, that her allegations were simply too extreme to believe.
I remember his words very clearly. He said, "She's not going to be believed. The jury's going to dismiss this." And I said, "What if they don't?" I said, "If they don't," I said, "and I are in deep trouble." Now, what he then said to me, and I'll remember this till the day I die. He then said, "Oh, but we don't want to be seen as pushing her too hard, because the jury will turn on the defence." And I said, "Well, what if she's not lying per se? What if she actually believes this? It's somewhere in the treatment that she's received, in the therapies, in the medication, in the way that she's been guided, all of the different therapies. What if she actually believes this? How horrible for her." But no, he just said, "No, we don't want to be pushing her because it's not going to look good in front of the jury."
Emily had failed to appear at previous court hearings, and her mother says she had always doubted that her daughter could repeat in court what she'd told police. But when Emily first appeared on the video screen in court, giving her evidence remotely from a nearby room, Susan Johnson was shocked. The last time she'd seen her daughter was on that country road 3.5 years earlier, looking bedraggled and dazed. Now she was well groomed, dressed in a crisp white shirt and a dark jacket, and she spoke clearly and calmly as the prosecutor began asking questions.
I remember clearly, I remember seeing her and just thinking she's okay. Honestly, my main concern was, is she going to survive this? Because I've always just thought she's going to take her life. But she looked well groomed. She looked like she was there to do a job, and almost like a lawyer herself. I just thought there is no way that girl can get up in that stand and say these things. She will fall apart. And that was what I backed on. So in the back of my mind, I just thought it's got to be all right, because the jury will see that this girl, it's not truthful. But as it was, as I know now, she believed these things and she was believable, and I was not prepared for that on any level.
Shadow of Doubt is a podcast investigation from The Australian. It's written and presented by Richard Guilliatt and produced and mixed by our multimedia editor, Lia Tsamoglou. I'm Editorial Director Claire Harvey, host of our daily news podcast, The Front, where you'll hear our journalists talking candidly about their stories. You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. Just say, play the news from The Australian to hear the latest episode. Subscribe to our channel CrimeX Plus on Apple Podcasts, or search The Australian wherever you get your podcasts. And you can check out all our journalism anytime at theaustralian.com.au.
in the next episode of Shadow of Doubt.
When you believe in truth, you just believe they would have seen through it, you know, but underneath it, I was absolutely terrified because I knew the alternative was going to prison.